Nintendo is launching a relatively high-priced machine into a market where many of the machine's existing customers may not be able to afford it. In videos before the Switch 2's launch, I explored why I anticipated $450 to be their most likely price point for the system, and I've demonstrated in previous videos the extent to which inflation inevitably will contribute towards game price decisions, with Donkey Kong Bonanza actually being slightly cheaper in real terms than the Switch launch titles back in 2017. However, inflationary price rises are cold comfort for people whose ability to pay those high prices is reduced due to economic considerations over the years, people's disposable income being squeezed. Furthermore, expectations are different. In the early 1990s, when A Link to the Past released, rental services such as Blockbuster were big. Free-to-start mobile games didn't exist, and the notion of a game backlog would have triggered derision. As Nintendo tries to push forward a new price, what is the future for consumers, and what steps have Nintendo already taken to pivot towards a new ecosystem? Before we look at Nintendo's specific initiatives, let's take a step back and consider their overall strategy. Nintendo generally aims to have a three-tier console approach: a top-of-the-line console, which is expensive, a middle-tier accessible option, and a cheaper model. In recent times, we've seen this with the Switch OLED, Switch, and Switch Lite, and the 3DS's tiering was slightly complicated by their decision relatively early on to move to the 3DS XL, but nevertheless, you can see the 2DS as the accessible model and the new 3DS XL as the top-of-the-line model for much of the middle phase of the system's run. Currently, the Switch 2 is the top-of-the-line model, but as it ages, it won't necessarily remain so. As manufacturing builds to a rhythm where economies can be found, they may be able to offer a price cut, although I think this is very unlikely. Panicked early door price cuts have a long history in the games industry, and famous examples include the 3DS and Saturn, but $450 is not sufficiently extreme to warrant a shock reaction, and depending on how it's constructed, they may not even have much margin for it anyway without taking a loss, although it appears that Doug Bowser has confirmed something that I've repeatedly said in anticipating the system cost, that they will aim to launch with a margin, having always done so in the past, even if with the Wii U and 3DS that margin was soon tanked due to currency issues. Another issue worth discussion is the far lower price of the Japanese-only model, and whether this suggests that they're selling it at a loss, and I think it's possible that they could have done so, or maybe they're only selling it at a low margin. However, they can afford to do this as a fluke of the expected trajectory of the Japanese and other exchange rates. If and when the yen strengthens against other currencies, as it's already doing, and as seems likely in the medium term, the console will become cheaper to produce for the Japanese market, and they will no longer be selling at a loss at that point. If the yen doesn't strengthen, the Japanese costs will be paid for by unusually high foreign exchange gains from sales in the rest of the world. In a sense, it's favouring the Japanese market, but because of the relative market sizes, making Japan a counterweight to the rest of the world does give them some leeway to mark down their home language console. The domestic market is always more reliable, and so they can afford to keep those costs down, and if the global markets suddenly swing back to a benevolent calm, Nintendo may feel they have more leeway. More likely, as inflation continues to erode the real terms cost of the system, $450 will become progressively more affordable to more people, and effectively the system will drop from their top tier product to their middle tier product by around 2030. Remember, Nintendo doesn't need or expect its entire base to be buying the Switch 2 on day one, and actually that wouldn't even be optimal. These early machines are going to be made at tighter margins than the later ones will be, and while they want to build up an initial install base and achieve momentum, they will have planned around a stable flow of consoles, and they also need to manage demand. High prices are one way to manage demand in the short term. Roughly, they need 15 million people, about an eighth of the current Switch regular consumer base, to move over in the first year. It stands to reason that there are enough people who are either highly motivated hardcore fans or sufficiently affluent not to be bothered by the price tag. People have discussed the difficulties faced affording the console by a great many people on low wages, and I'll have some separate analysis on that, but this issue is largely irrelevant to Nintendo's immediate concerns insofar as a top-of-the-line console, and by Nintendo standard this is top of the line, is not going to be primarily targeted at a low-wage consumer. But there is a console that they will target towards those consumers, and that console is called the Nintendo Switch. Lower income customers are far less likely to have exhausted the absolutely eye-wateringly large library of Switch games. Plus, they will continue with a slow but steady drumbeat of original titles, Pokemon Legends ZA and Tomodachi Life both being fairly significant titles. With the ability to sell Nintendo Switch 2 editions of games as well as Switch 2 exclusives, there is little friction to making a considerable number of games still operate on Switch, which now becomes their cheaper alternative console, supported potentially through to 2027 or beyond, when they can bring a cheaper Switch 2 variant to market. Even then, in Nintendo's tripartite structure of high, middle, and low-cost consoles, Switch may not disappear entirely and would continue as the lower-end model just as the 3DS continued to sell into 2020. Will they issue new games for it? Probably not, but possibly so if they're using older, cheaper cartridges or digital editions and the market is still there. It seems to me that if they make games that could run on Switch hardware, they can always release them as Switch 2 exclusives if they choose, and so I guess that 2027 and 2028 will have quite a few titles planned that will have people saying this could have been a Switch 1 game because, well, it may well have been a Switch game at an earlier point in its development, but as they get closer, they may decide to commit to it being a Switch 2 exclusive. Okay, that's all well and good, but what about those consumers, of whom there will be many, who push themselves to afford a console and to nab maybe Metroid Prime 4 or Donkey Kong Bonanza or one other game, but otherwise are cutting back on the purchases that they would otherwise have made if the console and the games were at a lower cost? A lot of people have commented to the effect that this is disastrous for Nintendo, but it's only really disastrous for them if they stop buying Nintendo games. If they choose to prioritize first-party titles over third-party titles, yes, they make a decent chunk from third-party, and yes, they want to encourage third parties on their system, but first-party games not only make more money, but they are a really solid investment in their future as they promote their brands and allow their brands to become more recognizable and widely enjoyed. Furthermore, if you can't or won't make your games cheaper, the other option has to be to make them better. To PlayStation 5 and Xbox devotees, this may mean graphics so shiny and polished you could eat off them, but as I've touched on in previous videos, for Nintendo I think this means coming up with concepts and play mechanics that are unique and exciting. Tears of the Kingdom's Ultra Hand mechanics and Donkey Kong Bonanza's destructible landscape being two of the most dramatic examples of this sort of thing. They are going to want to double down on promoting these titles aggressively for their unique gameplay features, and that means getting the games into people's hands. And here we have some of Nintendo's new innovations. Firstly, Game Share. For all the talk about $80 Mario Kart being terrible value for families, there is one point that could be very much in Nintendo's favour. The fact is that many families have had to shell out for 2 Mario Kart games minimum previously if they wanted their children to be able to play concurrently on Switch Lites, with an effective cost, therefore, of $120 for the 2 games. In a single swoop, Nintendo has removed this necessity and allowed people to play collaboratively far more easily. The extent of game share, of course, is still to be determined. How many games will benefit from it? But I could see it being in Nintendo's interest to expand this further and further outwards. And then there is renting. While the 90s game cartridges were generally eye-wateringly expensive at the time, the most common assertion made in response is that this was fine because people had more disposable income. However, as a portion of that income, games costing double what they do now in real terms was still a forbidding prospect, even as it is today, and so the rental market evolved to cope with the problem, and perhaps it may do so again. Now, clearly, it won't be quite the same. Xbox Game Pass and streaming services are already effectively a replacement for this kind of service. Netflix explicitly evolved as a rental service that then diversified into streaming. But we also need to consider virtual game cards and the potential to loan these out, albeit within a family group for 14 days. With the traditional rental market having long since disappeared in most places, this seems like Nintendo getting a jump on a similar concept of their own. Once companies like Blockbuster made a lot of money from buying games at wholesale prices and renting them out endlessly. After the games had been rented out a dozen or so times, further issuances were pure profit for them until they needed to replace games through wear and tear. Nintendo and other companies in the film and video game fields eventually got wise to this, and revenue sharing arrangements with the publisher started to be initiated, but by the time the 2000s hit, Blockbuster and its companies were pretty much bust anyway. Nintendo does not want their physical games being hawked around in the same way, with them not getting much of a cut, and since they are far more tied to physical than most companies, they would be more vulnerable to any potential rental revival. The fact is, though, online rental systems are very different. It strikes me that the 14-day rental system from person to person in a family group is a good way to test a more long-term model, while also encouraging people within families to talk about Nintendo and to trade and share. One comment on a previous video asked, do you think the Nintendo Selects brand will come back as a subscription service? Games that are past their prime but can still reel budget-conscious late adopters. Now, while I don't think this will be an immediate consideration, this definitely feels like a long-term possibility for Nintendo Switch Online or a variant of that service one day. The great advantage of a subscription service is the stability of cash flow. You may not even make quite as much as a one-off big budget title that can scoop 20 million a month like Tears of the Kingdom say, but you replace that with a far more resilient revenue stream. This is why I said back in October, only a week before they dropped the Nintendo Switch Online Alamo pre-orders and the Nintendo Switch Online test game, that they would want to make a special pitch to NSO subscribers around that time. It was 3 years since most people had transitioned to join the service for the launch of the expansion pack, and so they wanted to have a big offer that would keep those people who would make up a significant portion of the base plugged into Nintendo's ecosystem. It also seems that they have reached saturation point on the traditional NSO subscriptions, with subscriptions leveling off, and perhaps the expansion pack too may have, after more than 3 years, reached its limit. In other words, the time is ripe for such a system, and in theory, the same virtual game card technology could be used to initiate it. There are a few models. You subscribe to the service for a relatively small fee, or perhaps invest in a certain amount of rental credits to be used over a fixed period. The purpose of the fee would be to ensure that people at least have some standing investment in using the system and aren't just using it to play to death one specific game for a low price and then abandon it. However, past this paywall, the service would provide a library which you can rent for 2 weeks. I imagine some games, especially the more major ones, would have a small additional charge. This could include a substantial but not exhaustive library of Switch games, but also potentially Wii and GameCube titles as well dropped in. That's if they decide not to link it to NSO, of course. There would be a real art to thinking through which games to include so as not to damage their legacy sales. There's also the potential that they could simply have a wider variety of games available for only a limited period of time. This has several advantages to them. Firstly, if people do get excited by a rental game, it might drive people towards sales. This was always the way stores like Blockbuster could upsell to people. Oh, our rental copy of Gunstar Heroes is out on rental now and won't be back for a while, but there's a new version available for purchase. Of course, no such scarcity exists with digital copies as opposed to physical ones, and so Nintendo would need to essentially create that scarcity. The second advantage is that they get to put different franchises in front of people. Their bet has generally been that if people experience their games, they will want to play more, so getting their games to be seen by more people already predisposed to be interested in Nintendo content might be a good approach for them. If they had 2 or 3 new games every week, each available for rent for maybe a 1-month window, they would always have 10 to 12 titles available each month over the course of the year, given that some titles will be available in multiple months, and so they might need a catalogue of 80 to 100 games in the first year. Between the Switch, Wii, and GameCube libraries, and perhaps even with the odd Switch 2 title put in there, that could be sustainable. This seems like it could potentially replicate the effect of the old Nintendo Selects line while being far more flexible. I may deep dive that more fully at some point, but as I recall, they offered old games at 40% of the original price. There were many different rental systems, but many had a flat fee and then a standing charge per day. But if Nintendo decided to simplify it and have a 2-week block, then buying a rental game would be effectively the same, which would be around $25 for a Switch game and $30 for a Switch 2 game. That may well sound steep for a game that you don't end up even owning, but there would be a real risk to Nintendo in that there are probably a great many titles that people might play intensively for a short period of time but don't really return to afterwards. How would they know what those titles are? Well, fortunately, Nintendo have years and years of game playing data to study when making their decisions because they have hour by hour breakdowns of what people have done on their Switches over the years. Okay, so we've looked at the real-term price cuts, local game share, and renting as solutions that Nintendo has already got in place to ensure that people eventually come back to the Switch 2 fold, even if they are put off by the initial pricing. It is also likely that there will be some replacement for game vouchers. This isn't really a concern in the short term. It will be an odd thing to incentivize sales on a system at the same time as trying to scare off scalpers, and with the markets in some degree of turmoil, they may want to keep watchfully waiting until things settle down before making any commitments that might be hostages to fortune. But maybe before Christmas or perhaps sometime in 2026, it could make sense to reintroduce such an arrangement. Finally, they can simply make use of one of the oldest tricks in the book, the special offer. An $80 price tag with a 10% discount is equivalent to $70, but can often scan as a better deal. Effectively, with their limited edition Mario Kart Launch Day bundle, they have already used this same technique. $50 for Mario Kart World bundled in with the Switch 2 seems like a great deal if the game in question was $80, but a more meager discount if the game was retailing for $60. Bundles, one-off discounts, and such like are endlessly flexible for Nintendo, and they can respond to the data they see, the kind of data that we endlessly provide them through utilizing their game systems and apps to figure out how to make the right offers at the right time. All this said, I do think Nintendo is thinking very much in the long term. If Switch 2 lasts 8, 9, 10 years and can maintain the current price points, it will definitely restore Nintendo's reputation as being firmly in the lower cost end of the marketplace, purely through the effects of inflation on real-term prices. Well, until a $700 Switch 3 launches anyway. Do check out the videos on screen for more. Thank you so much to my Patreon supporters. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you next time for the next Nintendo Forecast.